I guess my involvement with the Hunter goes back effectively more than 25 years when I was campaigning as a rather young opposition leader. I think the reality in those days was the coalition probably took the area now called the Upper Hunter a bit for granted. Labor took most of the rest of it for granted. And we used to fight about Maitland. I think Milton Morris may still be here, but we used to fight about Maitland as a bit of a marginal seat. But I think that was probably the reality 25 years ago. And we did all right in 1988 from a Liberal National Party perspective, nowhere near as well, of course, as the coalition did a little over 12 months ago. But I seem to recall that the Independents won the seat of Newcastle and the seat of Swansea, and I then became an enthusiastic supporter of the Newcastle Rugby League team and helped them with the what was the first development of whatever the stadium is called now. Maybe it's Osgood Stadium, I don't know. The people of the area repaid me by defeating Mr Keegan and Mr Welsh quite comprehensively at the next election in 1991. But the only point I wanted to make is, and I'm not going to be partisan at all, because I'm what Mike said I was, which is independent and evidence-based as far as I can be. I do think the political economy changes in both the Illawarra and the Hunter are very, very good for those areas. The sheer practical reality is, and it applies either way, when one party dominates an area, city or Sydney or outside Sydney, for a long period of time, it just obviously and naturally does not go to the well-being of the political debate, the policy debate, and the nature of the area. So I think the fact that both the two regions, north and south of Sydney, in the sense of the Illawarra and the Hunter, have now got what you might describe as a mixed or in some ways normal political debate, has got to be a very positive thing for the future of those areas. This is the third time I've spoken for the Hunter Valley Research Foundation, once when I was in opposition, at least once, but maybe more when I was Premier, and I'm pleased to be here now because I do believe in regions. I was worried when Mike started saying he didn't think Hunter was a region, but he had a different meaning. I do think the sense of integration, which is what the Hunter Valley Research Foundation is about, trying to break down the silos, trying to make longer-term policy advice and policy positions, has to be the way to go. You know, we all talk about silos, and I think Paul Broad and I would say to you, silos are very hard to break down. It's fair to say Infrastructure New South Wales thinks that silos are very hard to break down. And you can draw anything you like from that with respect to the state of the state. I was then asked by one of nature's real gentlemen, Joe Tripodi, to help him with the Hunter Valley coal chain, and reluctantly, I think it was Christmas Eve, I was weakened, but I did take that on, and I'll come back to the coal chain and that exercise because I think it was a very, very positive exercise, not because of my involvement or leadership, but because of the nature of the process, and more particularly the results of the process, which I'll say a little about. And then, of course, in the last year or so that I've been Chairman of Infrastructure New South Wales, we clearly, and Paul, of course, is a Newcastle person. He's not a boy anymore, I notice. We've got a very clear interest and a direct interest, both because of the creation of the Hunter Valley Fund and the Hunter Valley Development Corporation, and Paul's personal interest, which is, of course, relevant. Now, that's all by way of background to saying that I agree entirely with Mike Gallagher that the Hunter is not just a region on its own, it is an integral part of the New South Wales economy, and indeed of the national economy, and that is frankly where Infrastructure New South Wales is directed to. We are directed to trying to make sure that there is the development of a long-term pipeline of projects which are not political projects, not projects sort of made up in the elevator between the ground floor and level 41 of Governor Macquarie Tower, and There were a few of those in the previous regime. We are unashamedly in the legislation and in the intent. We're about getting beyond the 4-year political cycle. We are about trying to get whole of government and whole of governments, federal, state, local, involvement in projects, and we're certainly about trying to focus on projects that provide the best bang for your buck, the best productivity outcomes. Because without getting the best productivity outcomes, the pace of economic growth in New South Wales, which is of course abysmal compared to the rest of Australia, the pace of that economic growth won't recover. So we are unashamedly focused towards productivity producing infrastructure. We're also unashamedly about involving the private sector, or at least being neutral. We don't frankly care which sector people come from, ideas come from, funding comes from. It's about the outcome. It's about the result. It's not about trying to have a political or philosophical or ideological view about public versus private. It is about trying to get results. So, I mean, you can assume that when our first cut of a 20-year state infrastructure strategy emerges in the third quarter of this year, it obviously will say a lot that's relevant to the hunter, and you wouldn't expect me to tell you precisely, although you'll guess from some of the things I'm going to say, where we will focus. It is going to be put economics, productivity, benefit cost ratios, all those sort of things above various other, you'd have to say, more political approaches. And I think the intention of the government is to have a debate in Parliament, and the government eventually will respond, and it no doubt won't agree with everything we say, but it is a serious attempt to have a non-partisan and evidence-based approach to infrastructure rather than the sort of project-based, rather than system-based and political short-term focus which has characterised infrastructure for a very long time indeed. That's, I think, the background. And look, I wanted to say a bit about the Hunter Valley Coal Chain, about transport, a bit about the Newcastle CBD, even though it's outside Infrastructure New South Wales's mandate, but I just can't resist an opportunity, and that might see out the 15 minutes that Eileen has given me. Look, I think the Hunter Valley Coal Chain, you simply need to look at the results. It's all about having everybody in one tent. It's about applying economic principles, in that case take or pay. And frankly, once one got the 13 or 14 coal companies 4 years ago, to agree to that principle, most other things follow logically. And the fact that the capacity of the port, the coal capacity of the port, is heading towards more than doubling what it was when that exercise started in 2008, and may well head towards trebling, may well head towards 300 million tonnes in the relevant future, is simply a result of getting a modern, practical, industry-based approach. It's a case of getting the government to butt out as much as possible. It's a case of getting the government to butt out in a financial sense as much as possible. And it's clearly about looking at the whole chain, not just at the port. I was talking about the whole chain. Clearly, I think there are still issues at the rail end. There are no doubt still issues at the port end that I'm no longer familiar with. But obviously, the work the ARTC is doing, I sometimes wonder why the ARTC has to spend federal taxpayers' money to the extent they do. You wonder whether there isn't scope for the industry to fund more of the rail assets as well as the port assets. But clearly, you do need to maintain and you need to continually improve the productivity of the Hunter Valley Coal Chain if you're going to get the sort of results we need. Frankly, and at the risk of being mildly controversial, which George told me I could be, the sort of nonsense that entertained some of you in the Hunter about Mr. Tinkler's coal loader aspirations was just bloody minded nonsense. Never had any sense at all. And you simply, if you've got something that works, the notion that you allow individual companies following their own self-interest, which is perfectly appropriate, but the notion that you would entertain individual companies breaking up the industry model that had been successfully developed, was really, really stupid. And my only regret is, frankly, that the determination took as long as it did. Shouldn't have taken anywhere near as long to come to the self-evident conclusion, which was that it was nonsense. I hope that's clear. I've seen some stuff the Hunter Valley Research Foundation has done about bottlenecks in the cold chain. I don't pretend to be across the detail, but one of the things that Paul and I and INSW have found is that spending bits of money, public or private, on getting rid of bottlenecks, doing small projects that improve things, tends to get you much better bang for your buck, much better economic returns to the state and indeed to the government than worrying only about big projects. So I do think that focus on bottlenecks that I saw in one of the HBRF papers makes great sense. And I think I don't want to say more than that about the cold chain, other than to say I do think it's been a great success, and I hope it will continue to evolve the way it has. The rest of transport, look, I don't know that anyone's read the very good report that federal and state bureaucrats and some private sector people did on regional aviation capacity. If I read the papers, you'd think it was all about where is the second airport. The truth is, it says 20, I think, from memory, different things about what you ought to do. It does say that Williamtown is not an airport for Sydney. It does say that about Canberra too. It says that you ought to develop Williamtown both to increase the civil capacity and to increase the aircraft-related capacity and to develop the aerospace precinct. And all of that, it seems to me, makes imminent sense. It means that that airport over the next 20 and 30 years, and we do have to get used to thinking about infrastructure in that long-term sense, that airport will become a more effective airport than it is, both for the Central Coast and for the Hunter, or that broad area. So, look, I think that's important, and at the end of the day, when the current sort of political hubbub dies down, I do hope that federal and state governments, and it is more a federal thing, will focus on all of the recommendations of that report, because the notion that aviation capacity is somehow irrelevant is sort of a strange view to have in the 21st century. And clearly Williamtown has significant employment prospects and significant transport prospects in terms of improvement. But I don't think we should delude ourselves, as I recall Bob Carr did in 1998, that it would be the second airport for Sydney. It won't be, but it has a very real role in my view. You'd expect that we're interested, from what I said earlier, in rail freight. Freight's not as exciting as passenger rail. It's actually much more important in many ways. We are interested in the rail freight bypass, whichever route, and you might expect us to be saying something about that because it just makes sense. In fact, trying to get the whole rail freight corridor separated right around Sydney and right around New South Wales is one of the things that really needs to happen. 25 years ago, while Murray and I thought that the answer to revitalising downtown Newcastle was to get rid of the rail line. While Murray and I were right in 1989 when we started Honeysuckle, and I noticed nothing's happened. This is a personal point of view. It's not an INSW view, although they're intelligent people, so they probably share the view. Look, I mean, really, I've said this to Tim and others. You can have political arguments, and I don't have to play that game. People, if you actually want the CBD of Newcastle to redevelop into something like what you would like, what anyone would like, you can't do it if the rail line stays. That's just my personal view, and the evidence is overwhelming. It's absolutely overwhelming that that's correct. You only need to walk down there, as I do quite regularly when I go to Bradkin meetings. No one uses the rail line. It is uneconomic, and it is totally disruptive of any long-term vision for the Newcastle CBD. And Minister Hazzard tells me he's into it and is going to reach a conclusion. And as I say, I acknowledge that there are political issues, although frankly I think the political issues are a bit mythical. But nevertheless, there are political issues and unions and all the usual groups involved. Just take my word for it. If you really want to fix the CBD, which you ought to because it's the heart and soul, then you can't do it with the rail line there. So you've got a choice. You leave the CBD looking a bit like Beirut on a bad Friday night, or you do get rid of the rail line. I do think it's as simple as that, but I've got to say to you that's a personal view and it's got nothing to do with INSW. I think that's almost enough for me. Eileen will hit me. Other than to say, we will have in our 20-year strategy, there'll be things about health, there'll be things about education. It is a total. It's not just what you might call transport infrastructure or economic infrastructure. There will be projects from the Hunter, and what we've been asked to do by the government is, in a fearless sort of way, grade them on their merit rather than on their political merit. And I think it's very desirable and probably courageous of Mr O'Farrell and the government to say, look, we want you to tell us what the experts really think about the desirability of hospitals or whatever it might be, and we, the government, will make the final decision. If we make different decisions, we'll say so, and we'll say, well, we've made a political decision to put this hospital above that one, and everyone will be able to form their own views. So, look, I hope you'll find when September comes that it's a useful step towards what Mike said in his remarks, which is to try and lift infrastructure a bit out of the short-term political ruck, because you know all these projects take years and years, and if they simply become a plaything of whichever political party every 3 or 4 years, then what you get is what we've got, which is frankly not tremendous underspending on infrastructure. It's just a lot of lousy decisions. And I'm hopeful that the work that INSW does statewide and in the Hunter in particular will help that process improve a little, and hopefully improve over a long period of time. Thank you very much for having me.